Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're breaking down one of the biggest reasons elk suddenly disappear in October: hunting pressure. If you've ever hunted the weeks after the rut and wondered where all the elk went, you're not alone. It's not that they've vanished, it's that they've adapted. After weeks of bugles echoing across the mountains in September, October feels quiet, cautious, and unpredictable. But that shift isn't random, it's a direct reaction to human behavior. Pressure from hunters, predators, changes everything: where elk feed, how they travel, and when they move, and even how they rest. The same basin that was full of bulls during the rut can feel empty overnight, and understanding why that happens is the difference between hiking through silence and punching your tag. In this episode, we're going to dig deep into how elk react to pressure, what actually changes in their behavior, how long it takes them to adapt, and where they go when they do. We're going to cover how to locate those refuge pockets other hunters miss, how to hunt pressured elk effectively without adding to their alarm, and when it's time to reset and move to a new area entirely. October elk hunting rewards those who pay attention to subtle changes, the kind of small shifts in movement and behavior that most hunters overlook. Once you understand how pressure reshapes the mountains, you're going to stop chasing ghosts and start finding elk again. When elk feel pressure, they don't just panic immediately. They adjust. It starts small, and if hunters keep pushing, it compounds fast. The first sign of pressure is silence. Herd bulls that were once vocal every morning stop bugling altogether, or they only sound off once from deep in the timber before going quiet. That silence doesn't mean they've left the area. It means they're switching to survival mode. Elk survive by using three primary defenses, right? You know, their nose, their ears, and their eyes, and their ability to avoid patterns. Once they sense human activity in a zone, they start using those tools relentlessly. You'll see it first in their timing. Elk that were feeding in the open meadows 30 minutes before daylight now wait until it's pitch dark. They shift their feeding patterns to the middle of the night and return to cover before you ever hit the trail. Bulls that used to bed on open benches start bedding lower, deeper, or in thicker timber where the wind is stable and visibility is limited. They no longer linger in exposed country. The more they're pressured, the less distance they move during daylight, relying on smaller core zones where they can hear, smell, and see approaching danger before it's close. Elk also respond to noise differently once pressure builds. The sound of a snapping stick or a faint call that might have brought them in 2 weeks earlier now triggers an immediate retreat. They've been educated. By the second or third week of October, especially in over-the-counter or heavily hunted units, elk have already learned that bugles often mean humans. That's why experienced hunters stop calling altogether in these conditions and start focusing on stealth and movement instead. The elk are still there, they're just adapting faster than a lot of hunters do. Another major shift comes in how they use terrain. In pressured areas, elk start traveling in unpredictable routes. Instead of following the same easy saddle or ridge trail, they begin side-hilling through tougher country, right? Rougher stuff, or crossing drainages higher or lower than usual to avoid predictable ambush points. They also take advantage of steep slopes, deadfall, and thick young timber where hunters are least likely to follow. If you find yourself in an area where every trail seems beaten flat, but there's no fresh sign, that's a red flag. The elk are nearby, but they've shifted their routes just far enough to stay hidden. Elk that have been pressured hard also rely heavily on wind and thermals. They'll bed in places where air currents swirl just enough to alert them to danger from multiple directions. It's not uncommon to find bulls bedding on narrow benches above cliffs or inside tangled creek bottoms where the wind changes constantly. Those spots may seem chaotic to hunt, but that unpredictability is exactly why elk chose them. They trust their nose more than anything, and if the wind keeps them informed, they feel safe. The key takeaway is that hunting pressure doesn't make elk vanish. It just pushes them into patterns that are quieter, smaller, and harder to predict. They adapt quickly, often within a single day of heavy activity, right? If you're seeing old sign but no fresh movement, it's a sign that you're hunting the echo of where elk were before pressure changed the landscape. To stay successful, you have to shift as fast as they do, because when elk go silent and cautious, that's when the real hunt begins. Once pressure settles in, elk begin reprogramming their entire rhythm. Their daily patterns compress, their movements become more deliberate, and the structure of how they use the mountain changes. In lightly hunted areas, elk maintain wide, predictable loops between bedding and feeding zones. But once multiple hunters start pushing through those same ridges and basins, those loops shrink fast. Elk stop wasting energy on long distance movement and instead focus on small, secure zones that give them what they need without the risk of exposure. The first thing to change is their feeding schedule. Early in the season, elk feed in open country where they can see danger coming, using broad meadows, burns, or high alpine basins. But when pressure builds, they begin feeding later at night and earlier in the morning, often under the cover of timber. They move less, feed faster, and stay closer to thick cover. If you're seeing old tracks in the open and nothing fresh, that means you're on the edge of their previous pattern. They've likely shifted a few hundred yards or even just one ridge over into country that provides the same forage but far more security. The elk that survive year after year are the ones that make those subtle adjustments first. Bedding behavior changes too. Bulls and cows both move into steeper, darker, and denser cover where they can monitor their surroundings. They'll often bed on benches with multiple exit routes or near small breaks in the terrain that let them drop away from pressure quickly. You might glass a basin that held elk weeks before and see nothing, but that doesn't mean they left the drainage. It just means they slid into thicker timber, maybe a finger off to one side, out of view. These shifts are often small in distance, but huge in impact. Elk are masters of turning visibility against you, and when their daily routines shorten, that's exactly what they're doing. Weekly patterns change too. As pressure builds over consecutive days, elk begin rotating their use of terrain. They may move through an area every few days instead of daily, resting in between visits. This creates the illusion that they've vanished, when in reality, they're running a new schedule. Experienced hunters start to notice those rotations, seeing fresh sign appear every third or fourth day in certain spots, and adjust their timing accordingly. That kind of patience and observation lets you ambush elk when they cycle back through. The presence of human scent has an even longer lasting effect than noise. Once elk associate a drainage with consistent human odor, they're going to abandon it entirely for days or even weeks. And that's why overhunted drainages feel dead by mid-October, while the next drainage over might be alive with fresh tracks and poop. Elk don't have to move far to feel safe. They just have to move out of your pattern. The moment you realize that you're hunting where every other hunter walks, it's time to make a lateral move. Not a long one, but a smart one. Another subtle shift comes with temperature and daylight changes. As October progresses and the first cold fronts hit, elk start moving down in elevation naturally, but pressure accelerates that process. In some cases, herds that would normally stay high until late October move down 2 or 3 weeks early simply because they're being pushed from every direction. That's why some of the best mid-October hunts happen at elevations where most hunters overlook. Mid-slope benches, north-facing drainages, and smaller transition zones that still offer shade and feed, but see far less human activity. When you recognize these shifts, you stop wasting time glassing empty basins and start anticipating where elk will feel safe next. They adapt their daily and weekly patterns to pressure faster than a lot of hunters can react, and the hunters who consistently find them in October are the ones who think like survivors. They read the changes, move quietly, and position themselves just outside the chaos, waiting for the mountain to settle and for the elk to return. When pressure starts stacking up, Elk don't vanish into thin air. They relocate into places most hunters won't go or don't notice. Every mountain range has a few of these refuge zones. They're rarely far from where elk were before, but they're tucked in just enough out of sight or out of reach that most people overlook them. The difference between an empty ridge and one full of elk often comes down to one ridge, one drainage, or one subtle break in terrain that hunters consistently skip. Once you learn how to identify those sanctuaries, you're going to start finding elk where everyone else thinks they're gone. Elk are masters at using terrain to their advantage, and they gravitate toward areas that give them multiple layers of security. Look for country that's hard to access quietly, steep, brushy, or full of deadfall. Those places wear you down physically, so that's exactly why elk feel safe there. A narrow side drainage with tangled timber, a north-facing slope covered in downfall, or a bench hidden behind a rock face can hold elk all through October because a lot of hunters simply don't put in the effort to reach them. When the woods go silent and sign disappears from obvious basins, start looking toward the ugly country, the places that don't photograph well, that require crawling under logs or side-hilling through thick brush. That's where elk retreat when they've had enough of human contact. Mid-elevation terrain becomes especially valuable in October too. When most hunters focus on high country basins or low elevation migration corridors, pressured elk often settle right in the middle. Those zones offer a balance of feed, cover, and stable wind. They're not as exposed as open alpine terrain and not as noisy or thermally unstable as deep valley bottoms. They're also easier for elk to navigate quietly. Benches, finger ridges, and small shelves between 8,000 and 9,000 feet often hold isolated bulls or small groups of cows through the harder rifle season. If you find fresh poop, broken branches, and tracks weaving through that kind of country, slow down, you're in the right zone. Another overlooked type of refuge is what I call micro pockets. Those are small, isolated features that a lot of hunters don't even register as habitat. A tiny aspen patch surrounded by thick pines, a 2-acre meadow hidden below a rim, or a narrow bench between cliffs. Those small areas can become temporary sanctuaries once pressure builds. Elk don't need hundreds of acres to feel safe. They just need enough cover, feed, and distance from human scent to rest undisturbed. You're going to often find those micro pockets by accident, especially if you're still hunting through timber or using terrain to glass smaller cuts. Once you find one, mark it. Elk will often return to the same pockets year after year once they're used to them and they feel safe in those zones. Water is another magnet for pressured elk. When human activity pushes them deeper into cover, they still need reliable hydration. Hidden seeps, shaded springs, or small creeks deep in timber often become gathering points. If you can find one of those water sources in an otherwise dense area, you've found a hub of activity. You may not see the elk immediately, but fresh mud, tracks, wet poop, or recently disturbed leaves will tell you the story. The challenge in those spots isn't just in finding the elk, it's in getting close without being detected. What separates a lot of successful hunters from the rest is the willingness to think beyond the obvious. Overlooked pockets exist everywhere, but they rarely stand out on a map. You're going to have to find them through curiosity, patience, and a willingness to go where others don't. Sometimes that means side-hilling one ridge further than anyone else. Sometimes it's dropping 1,000 feet lower while everybody else hunts high. Those aren't guesses. They're calculated moves based on how elk use terrain when they're pressured. When you find a spot that feels too tight, too steep, or too thick to hold elk, check it anyway. That's often exactly where they are. Once you've located where pressured elk are hiding, the way to hunt them has to change completely too. The aggressive, fast-paced approach that works during the rut can often destroy your chances in October. When elk go quiet and retreat into refuge zones, it's no longer about how far you can hike or how loud you can call. It's about how precisely and quietly you can move. Every decision in pressured country needs to be slow, deliberate, and built on reading subtle sign instead of relying on sound. The first adjustment is your pace. You can't bulldoze your way through timber and expect elk to tolerate it. You've got to slow down to the point where you're still hunting, not hiking. Move a few steps, stop, scan, listen. Look for horizontal lines that break the natural vertical flow of the forest. Listen for soft footfalls, the faint snap of a twig, or the muffled sound of movement ahead. The quieter and more observant you become, the more the woods start revealing what's really happening. Pressured elk are incredibly sensitive to rhythm too. They can tell the difference between natural noise and human cadence. So your goal has to be to blend into the natural tempo of the mountain. Move when the wind gusts, stop when it's still, and never force progress when your instincts tell you to wait. Trust your gut. Calling should be used sparingly, I think, in October, if at all, especially in the later weeks. In October, most elk have heard every version of a bugle and every cow call in the book. Now, this is going to depend on your particular area, but a lot of times they've been chased, called to, and spooked enough to associate those sounds with danger. The only calling that might still work is subtle contact sounds. A soft mew or a single chirp to let an elk know you're another elk, not a predator. Anything beyond that usually backfires, in my experience. In heavily hunted units, silence becomes your best weapon. Let your presence stay unknown until the moment you decide to act. Wind discipline becomes even more critical in pressured areas. Elk that have survived multiple encounters have learned to trust their nose above all else. You can beat their eyes with cover and their ears with timing, but you'll never beat their sense of smell. Always test the wind before you move, even if you just tested it 30 seconds ago. In thick timber, thermals shift constantly as sunlight filters through the canopy. If you feel a draft on the back of your neck, you've got to stop immediately and reposition. I like to plan every stalk or ambush with multiple fallback routes. So if the wind switches, I can fall back without alerting the herd. Sometimes walking away is what keeps the mountain quiet enough to hunt it again tomorrow. Another key factor is minimizing ground scent. Every step you take leaves a trail of information behind. Elk may not smell you directly, but if they cross your tracks an hour later, they might change their pattern for days. Move through the wind's path, not across it, and avoid cutting directly through bedding or feeding zones if you're not planning to hunt them that day. Every time you enter a spot, think about the long game, how your presence will affect elk movement over the next week. Pressured elk treat scent the same way humans treat alarm systems. Once it's tripped, they change everything. Patience wins in these conditions. The biggest mistake a lot of hunters make after finding fresh sign is to press too hard. You can tell how close you are to elk by how fresh the poop feels, right? How sharp the tracks look, and how recently the ground was disturbed. When you know they're close, that's when you slow down even more. Take 10 minutes to move 10 yards if you have to. The moment you start rushing is usually the moment you'll bump them. Pressured elk don't give second chances. When they blow out, they don't stop 100 yards away. They run until they're in another drainage. You're either perfect or you're done. When you do get a chance, make it count. Pressured elk rarely stand still for long. Be ready before the opportunity appears. Range your lanes, know your wind, and have your draw or rest plan already mapped out. If you're caught off guard fumbling for gear or trying to reposition, the opportunity often vanishes as quickly as it appeared. Hunting pressured elk isn't about luck or quick reactions. It's about being so prepared and so in sync with your equipment and the environment that when the chance finally comes, you're already ready. The hunters who thrive in October are the ones who slow down enough to notice everything. The smell of fresh sign, the faint glint of hair on a branch, the pattern of shadows moving across a slope. They adapt to elk instead of forcing elk to adapt to them. When you can move through pressured country without changing the rhythm of the mountain, that's when you start seeing elk a lot of hunters never will. Sometimes, no matter how smart you hunt or how careful you are, pressure pushes elk out of an area altogether. It happens slowly at first, then all at once. One day you're seeing tracks and hearing distant mews, and the next morning it's dead quiet. No sign, no sightings, no droppings. That's the mountain's way of telling you it's time to reset. The hardest part for a lot of hunters isn't recognizing that the elk have left. It's accepting it and moving on. But knowing when to relocate is just as important as knowing how to stalk. The faster you can read those signs, the less time you're going to waste hunting empty country. When elk abandon a drainage, it usually follows a clear path. The first indicator is timing. You start noticing that movement windows shrink to nothing. No elk at dawn, no sign at dusk, no new tracks on established trails. Then you'll see secondary sign fade. Poop turns dry, wallows crust over. There's no more trails that were sharp, those become dull. Those clues mean the herd has moved on, often pushed by a combination of scent, sound, and consistent human pressure. Once that happens, the only productive move is to find where the elk went next instead of waiting for them to come back. The direction of that move depends on terrain and pressure flow. In a lot of western mountain ranges, elk retreat away from the heavy access points, right? Your trailheads, your roads, your popular glassing basins, and they do it efficiently. They don't wander aimlessly. They slide laterally into adjacent drainages, drop into deeper timber, or climb into rougher, steeper pockets where pressure fades. You can track this progression by studying maps and on-the-ground sign. When you find a drainage with older sign tapering off, look one drainage over. If that next one has fresh tracks, wet poop, and newly torn up ground, you've just found the new core zone. Elk move like water under pressure. They flow to wherever resistance is lowest. Resetting doesn't always mean hiking miles away either. Sometimes moving just a half a mile into harder terrain puts you back into fresh elk. The key is learning to read the flow of human activity just as carefully as you read elk sign. Pay attention to where other hunters are parking, glassing, and calling. Watch how the mountains funnel people just as they funnel elk. If you can figure out where pressure is coming from, you can predict where elk are going. They'll rarely cross through the center of that chaos. They're going to slip around it. Your goal is to be waiting in that quiet corner where the herd feels safe again. When elk do shift to new ground, give them time to settle before pushing in. A day or two of rest often resets their confidence. If you dive in too soon, a lot of times you're going to repeat the same cycle that pushed them out in the first place. This is where patience pays off. Use that time to scout from afar, glass shadowed ridges, monitor thermals, and listen during early morning hours when the air carries sound. Once you confirm their new location, approach carefully, treating the area like it's fragile. Pressured elk live on edge, and that first mistake you make may push them out again. In extreme cases, especially during rifle season or in heavily hunted over-the-counter units, elk will move out of an entire zone or elevation band. When that happens, elevation and weather become your guides. If the pressure is heavy up high, start looking mid-slope. If the pressure extends all the way through timberline, check the broken foothill country or private boundaries where elk can find safety and easy escape. Don't assume they've gone miles. Elk conserve energy by finding the closest sanctuary possible. They're not running from hunters necessarily. They're just repositioning to survive them. Resetting the game also means resetting your mindset. It's easy to take it personally when an area that once held elk turns empty, but that's part of October hunting. The mountains change week by week and every hunter leaves an impact. The most successful hunters are the ones who recognize those shifts early and make adjustments without hesitation. They let go of "this spot used to be good" mentality, right? And instead they focus on where elk are right now. Every time you adapt faster than the pressure moves them, you gain an edge. That edge is what builds consistency year after year. When elk finally resettle, they're often more predictable than they were before. Their world has shrunk, their caution is heightened, and their routines become tighter. If you can locate that new pocket, move with precision, and maintain silence, your odds of success actually increase. By resetting your approach instead of fighting old patterns, you position yourself where other hunters aren't and where the elk feel safe again. In pressured country, that's the closest thing to home field advantage you can get. October is the month that separates a lot of hunters who react from hunters who adapt. When the bugles fade and the pressure builds, a lot of people assume the elk are gone, but they're not. They've just changed the rules. Hunting pressure doesn't eliminate opportunity, it reveals who's paying attention. Every track, every shift in pattern, every pocket of quiet country tells a story about how elk are surviving. The hunters who slow down, read that story, and move with precision are the ones who keep finding elk long after everybody else is packed out. Understanding how pressure reshapes behavior is what turns frustration into strategy. You stop chasing memories of where elk used to be and start finding them where they are right now, tucked into dark timber, feeding at odd hours, and slipping through country a lot of hunters never touch. When you learn to recognize those adjustments early and hunt them deliberately, October becomes one of the most rewarding months of the season. The mountains get quieter, but the opportunity can get sharper. Elk don't just stop being elk because hunters show up. They just start playing defensive. Your job is to understand that defense better than they do. Stay patient, stay observant, and never let pressure push you out of the game. If you're serious about taking this kind of knowledge deeper, that's exactly why I built Team Backbone. It's more than just a membership. It's a way to sharpen your edge with exclusive tools, strategies, and a tribe of hunters who refuse to quit. Inside, you're going to get 20% off site-wide on all Backbone Unlimited gear, a member-only t-shirt shipped to your door every month, not available anywhere else, full access to the digital content vault of guides, checklists, fitness programming, backcountry strategies, and mindset training, a private Facebook group with direct access to me and a community of driven hunters who live relentless, direct call, text, or email access to me for personalized advice on training, hunting strategy, or just sharpening your edge, and automatic entry into monthly gear giveaways. This is built for the guys who train for the hunt, push themselves in the off-season, and want to be part of a tribe that makes them better. If you're ready for that kind of inner circle, then Team Backbone is waiting for you at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.